I have so many layouts open today because I have a lot of tips and tricks to show you. All right, so let's just talk about what we're going to talk about today. So here is our outline. So we're going to present several tips and tricks that can help your analysis become more efficient. And so there's something new here for all of you. I think whether you're a newbie or a veteran FCS Express user, you will probably learn something that you didn't know. And you know, we might do another one of these webinars in the future because I didn't even include all the tips and tricks. I've just included some of them that I think are going to be useful for a lot of you. But there's so many settings and features in FCS Express that we couldn't possibly cover all of them. But here's some of the broad categories that we are going to cover. So I'm just going to briefly go over these large categories, and then we're going to come back and delve into each one. Okay, so, and this recording, this webinar will be recorded, and we will put this online for you as well. So don't feel like you need to take copious notes, just kind of sit back, relax, get an idea of some of the tips and tricks that could be helpful for you. So the first broad topic we're going to talk about here is customizing FCS Express, and that's going to include customizing the ribbon and tabs interface for commands that you tend to use more often or want to look for them. You tend to look for them in a place where they're not right now, so you want to sort of move little buttons around. I'm going to show you how to do that. Secondly, I'll take you into the default user options, and so that basically determines how FCS Express functions by default. So there's lots of different options. There's hundreds of them. We're just going to cover a handful that I see my users changing quite often to suit their preferences. Okay, then we're going to move on to using keywords. So don't worry if you don't know what keywords are. Basically, it's metadata that's acquired with your FCS files at the time of acquisition on your cytometer. So even if you don't know what keywords are, you do have some keywords in your data, and they can be useful. And for those of you who do know what keywords are, and you've been entering in extra keywords for descriptors when you're doing your acquisition, I'm going to show you how you can bring those keywords into FCS Express into various parts of your layout. Okay, then we're going to move on to gating tips. So there's a lot of flexibility with gating. It's very robust, the functionality. I'm not going to go through how to do gating in general because we've covered that in Getting Started webinars. We also have a gating specific webinar. So I'm not really going to go into the details of how to do gating, but I am going to show you a few tips for specialized techniques that you might not have been aware of. Okay, so that should be useful for a lot of you, I think. Then we're going to move on to access issues. So we get a lot of questions in our support desk about access scaling, and I'm going to talk about a couple different things, scaling for different instruments, different scaling types, you know, min and max, that kind of thing. Those are the types of questions we tend to get probably a few times a week at least, and also some other tips that relate to access labels. Okay, then I'm coming over to the right-hand side of my screen now. We're going to talk about various formatting settings that help you view your histogram data more cleanly, okay? And that's going to include smoothing overlays, normalizing overlays, turning on your legend so you can see what overlay is derived from, whether it's derived from different files at different gates. So that's really pretty basic functionality, but I think a lot of folks are not aware of all the different options, and I just think it's good to be aware because they're all for cosmetic purposes only, so they're not going to mess up your statistics in any way. You're always going to get the true statistics back no matter what you do there. So I want you to be aware of all the options so you can present your data as you need. I'm going to show you some tips and tricks that relate to plot placement in your layout. So we have a couple layouts open for that we'll kind of cover towards the end. And in that same vein, we're going to talk about general layout formatting. So there's a few tips in terms of like using layout pages and standardizing your layout format to look more professional. So I'm going to show you that. Okay. We're gonna, in the same vein of layout formatting, we're gonna talk about navigators. And so these are tools for navigating complex layouts. So a lot of our customers have very complicated layouts with, dozens of gates or dozens of pages or more or both. And sometimes it's kind of hard to find the particular plot you're looking for or the particular gated populations, where they're presented on various pages. So the navigators are really designed to help you find your way around those large or complex layouts. Okay, the last three here, these are sort of not related to data analysis at all, but I'm going to show you some quick ways to export images in various formats. I'm going to show you how to reuse your layouts as templates, because once you've spent 20 minutes or half an hour or a couple hours designing your layout, why recreate the wheel when you repeat the experiment? So a lot of times you're repeating the same experiment multiple times with different sets of data, right, or different time points. So rather than starting from scratch, you can just recycle your old layouts with new data. And that's going to be a very powerful time-saving technique for you. Okay. And lastly, I'm going to show you something about autosave and layout history, which is a nice way to sort of just keep older versions of your layouts automatically, so you don't have to necessarily keep, saving layouts under different names if you're not sure which iteration of the layout you want to go back to. Okay, so that is that's the agenda for today. I think that's going to be plenty, so we'll probably fill up at least 40 minutes or so. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started. So let's talk about customizing FCS Express. So why don't I come up to this layout here? And you know what? My computer is freaking out a little bit. So I am going to just close down some of these. I don't know if there's some updates going on in the background or something, but I just want to give my computer a little bit room to breathe here. So sorry. Okay. All right, that should help. I just close down a couple layouts. So let's come over to this one here. So how do we customize our ribbon and tabs interface? So we have our ribbon and tabs organized in a way that is reminiscent of Microsoft Office Suite. So for instance, all the gating tools are here on the gating tab. The text tools for text formatting and tables, etc., they're here on the text tab. Right, you have data-related tools like your data list, et cetera, on the data tab. So it's all pretty logically laid out, but sometimes, you might be looking for a certain button and it's not where you would expect. So for instance, the gate view, which is a legend, an interactive legend of your gates, you can see it here. I've just put it down here in the lower right corner of my layout. Because it's an object, it's here on the Insert tab. But I think a lot of people tend to look for it on the Gating tab since it is related to gating. So I'm going to use this one as an example of how to customize your ribbon and tabs interface to make it more easy for you. So you would simply right-click on the ribbon, not on the button, but just elsewhere on the ribbon, within one of the tab groups, and you would choose here Customize the ribbon. Okay, and then on the left-hand side here, I'm going to come to where that gate view is. It's under here, Insert General. There it is, my gate view. And I'm going to drag and drop it into my gating tab, specifically into the Create Gates group. So why don't I drag it up here? All right, so now when I click OK, you can see that my gate view is now here on my gating tab. Okay, it is still on my Insert tab because I didn't take it off of the Insert tab. Hold on. Oh, whoops, there we go. Yeah, so it's still here on my Insert tab, but now it also lives on my gating tab. Okay, so you can customize your ribbon to your heart's content there. If you don't like what you've done, just come to File, System, and this button here under Restore Options, you go to Reset Toolbars to Default Settings, and that'll put everything back to default. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the next item on the agenda within that category, which is often changed default user options. And the things I'm going to talk about under there are listed here. So we're going to talk about adding the gate to the plot title, a couple of different histogram related user options such as smoothing and normalization. And then we're going to talk about some axis issues like scaling and setting up your axis labels. Okay, so let's go back to that layout we were on. Okay, bear with me one second. I'm just going to quickly change something in my options here. Okay. Alrighty, so let's go to the layout that we were on before. If I can get my computer to, there we go. All right, so we can go to our options by going to File tab, Options, and this is where you'll be able to change all your default user options. So I'm going to change a couple of those frequently changed ones with you. So the first one we'll do is I'm going to come to Plots, Titles, and the default is just to show the file name and the title. But if you want to add your gate of the plot to the title, you would just put your cursor down here below the file name and click on current gate. And now for all future layouts or all newly inserted plots, you will see that the gate name is going to be automatically in the plot title. So it's not going to take effect retroactively on existing layouts, but going forward, that's what it will do. There is, of course, a way to just change your plots piecemeal one by one in existing layouts. So don't worry, that's all very flexible. Let's talk about some of the histogram options that I mentioned. So if you come down here to the histogram category, you can come to, for instance, overlays. And so FCS Express doesn't smooth your data by default. So I'll show you a little bit more in detail about this when I come back to the layout. But for those of you who already know what I mean, this is where you would change your smoothing, to any value that you want if you want to be smoothing by default. So this, again, it's not going to affect your statistics. It's cosmetic only. You probably want to select all the overlays and apply the same smoothing to all of them. Okay, there's also normalization options here under histogram specific options. So we don't normalize by default, but there's a couple different normalization options, which I'll show you when I just go back to the layout itself. It'll be more illustrative that way, but that's where it is if you want to change it, okay? There's a lot of other options. I'm not gonna, cover all of them you see under all of these nodes, but although I'm not going to go into it, you certainly could browse around yourself. Like if you are doing multi-cycle analysis, you can expand the DNA node here and, change various default settings for your multi-cycle plots, okay? So don't be afraid to look around in there. We have plenty of documentation in our manual about that too. But the last thing I want to show you for now in the default user options is axis related issues. So if you come down to the bottom category called data loading, okay, so I just clicked on it, and then come to FCS file options and go one level deeper to instrument specific settings. What you want to do is, in most cases, just click on default FCS 3.0 because most cytometers that are your workhorse cytometers, such as like the BD FACS, the BD LSR2 or FACS area, things like that, or many other cytometers that you're using on a regular basis, they're going to fall under this default FCS 3.0 format. That's referring to the data file format, okay? We do have other instrument-specific settings up here, and most of them are set up for what most of our users like to see their data as, so you can root around in here. I'm not going to talk about those today, but I just want you to know that they're there, and they have various scaling associated differently for instance, scatter parameters versus fluorescence parameters. But I'm not going to go into detail about that today. What I do want to draw your attention to instead is axis labels. So you might find incomplete info on your axes when you first load your data into FCS Express, and I'll show you an example layout of that in a moment. So you might have something like FL1 or FTSE, but you want it to say FTSE CD4 on the axis, right? So if you've entered in those antibody names under your stain keyword, sometimes they're just called antibody or stain depending on your acquisition acquisition user interface, depending on what cytometer you're using. But the most complete set of data would be name and stain or stain and name, okay? So you can change this and then that will take effect in all new layouts. There is a way to make the axis labels update in existing layouts, and I will show you the knowledge base page about that towards the end, okay? But the best thing is before you even begin your work, if you know that you want to have as much info as possible on your axes, such as the fluorophore and the antibody, or the detector and the antibody, or however you entered it in at the time of acquisition, you'll want to change it here, okay? So I'm going to change that to stain and name and say okay. All right, so here's what I'm talking about. Like if you take a look at this layout as an example, we only have some partial info on the axes here. So I just have the antibody names, the CD45 on this plot on the left, or the CD1656 on this plot on the right. If I take a look at my header by coming here to view header, I can double check if more info was entered in, and it was. So I have the antibody names under stain, but I also have the fluorophore names under name. So because I've changed now my plot axes user option to stain and name, when I go to the next data file, or if I were to open up a new layout, so I'm going to do the former, I'm just going to go to the next data file. Now you see we have the full information coming up. So we have the CD1656 and the PEA. Okay, so again, set that up before you start building your layout. That's the best way to go. There's another option here relating to axis labels. Like if you hadn't entered in very clear information at the time of acquisition, you can just come here to Tools, Parameter Labels, Modify Labels, and then you can start setting this up here. So I'm not going to actually go through it, but you just click Add Set, and we do have the full information in our manual about parameter labels. Just look for parameter labels in our help resources, and that will walk you through. You basically have to set up the descriptive info that you want for each parameter individually, and then you set your plot axes to view parameter labels on the axes. Okay, so that's another option for you. All right. And so since I do have this layout open, I will just show you a little bit about the smoothing and normalization for histograms. So like this top histogram here, it's not smoothed and it's not normalized. Again, these are things you can set up in your default user options that I just showed you 2 minutes ago. This one down here, it is smoothed. So rather than the data looking so ragged, the surrounding bins of each data point are averaged together, and it gives the histogram literally a smoother appearance. So this histogram here on the left is smoothed. And then these two histograms on the bottom that I've highlighted, they are smoothed and normalized, okay? So let's take a look at those options. Okay, so first of all, if you increase the smoothing, like right now it's 12, if I change it to 20, you see that the data looks even more smoothed, okay? I can come to, let's take a look at just this middle histogram and look at the normalization options. Right now this is normalized to peak value, so it makes it look like both histograms have the same height of their max peak. That's not going to affect your statistics. It's just for visualization. And this histogram on the bottom right, instead it was normalized to number of events, and that normalizes the area under the curve, okay? And then you can also play with this based on value. So right now, the y-axis is showing 20 because it's normalizing it to a value of that particular file. You can change it to one of the other files. Oh, these are both actually the same file. They're just different gates within the same file. Or you can change it to based on value. So, 1,000 or 100, whatever it is. This would be what the axis would look like if you had 10,000 events per overlay. Okay. So again, that's not something that that's going to affect your statistics. So to get to the user options window, I'm seeing a question coming up. You would just go to File tab, Options, okay? Or you can come down here and go to Options, and that would set up your default user options going forward. Okay, so there's other things you can do about histograms, which are pretty nice. So let's do it to all these three at the same time. I just dragged my cursor around all three to select them all, or you can do a command click on Mac or a control click on PC. Those are standard multiple selection commands that work across many programs in the operating system that you're in. So one thing I'm going to show you is if I want to set my second overlay, which corresponds to my granulocytes, to match the color of my granulocytes gate, which I've set as green, I can just come down here to green, the color option rather, and select green. And now you see my second overlay in that bottom row of histograms has become green. I can select both of these overlays and decide to fill them. Maybe I want to put in some transparency so it's easier to see through the layers. And that's really nice, especially if you're starting to accumulate a lot of histogram overlays on the same plot. It helps you see through them to see the structure of each histogram. Okay, are there any questions about that? The only other thing I will mention is if you're doing histogram overlays and you have, like, let's say you want to do a batch process, and you want to anchor an isotype control or a positive control on one of those histograms while still batching through the other overlay, you would just kind of select your control one here, or maybe it's my second one is my control, and then you would uncheck this box here, change data file during next previous batch. So I'm not going to get really into detail about that because we have a batch-related webinar, an iteration management webinar coming up next week, I believe. So I hope you'll tune into that, because my colleague is going to speak all about that. But I just wanted to point out that box since we're on the topic of histograms. Okay, so I'm going to close that layout and move on to our next topic, which is using keywords. So how do we use keywords in FCS Express? So like I mentioned, keywords are metadata, textual metadata that's associated with your FCS files. And you have keywords even if you don't realize it, because your cytometer adds certain keywords to your data files, such as the date of acquisition. So if I wanted to add the date of acquisition to my plot title, I could just double click on the plot to open up my formatting options, come to title, and if I want to put the date down here, I would go to insert token drop-down menu and choose keyword, and then click on this little ellipse. And now you've got a list of all the textual metadata or keywords that was added to your data when you acquired it. So here's $date, so I'm going to add that in. All right, if I wanted to add in multiple ones, you could certainly select multiple ones at a time. I'm just going to put in $date. There's other ones down here as well. Sometimes the interesting ones that the user has entered in, like descriptive sample IDs or experiment names, those tend to be towards the end, past all the $sign keywords. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. So now you see we have the date of acquisition showing up there in the plot title, right? I can also add that to my data list. So if you click on the wrench here, you can add that in by the same method. Okay, so if you wanted to, if you had different samples that were acquired on different dates, you could sort by date. There's another kind of keyword you can add. So if you haven't, let's say you wanted to add like a sample ID or a drug name from a drug library screen you were doing or something like that, but you didn't enter it in at the time of acquisition, you can certainly add that in afterwards using extra keywords files. And so what I mean by that is in the same folder on your computer where you have the data files. So that's this folder here, and these are my data files, these April mono files. Put another CSV file. You can create the CSV file in Excel and just call it extra keywords table.csv like you see here. And here is what the CSV file should look like. So you're going to need a column with all your file names exactly as they exist on your computer, and then have a separate column for every additional keyword you want to add. So you see I've added another keyword here for sample type, which is the organism each file came from, zebra, ostrich, and guppy. And then I have another column here for the subject age. Okay, so you could add in additional columns. So keep in mind, if you add additional columns, you're going to need to quit and restart FCS Express completely to have the additional columns showing up in FCS Express if you've already loaded up the layout. Okay, but let me just close that and come back to FCS Express. So I can add in, you see I already added in sample type here. Okay, so I can add in any other keywords from that extra keywords file. So if I go all the way to the bottom, and that's where they'll be, by the way, you can click on subject age, for example, and add that. And now I have quite a few keywords here in my data list. Okay, and I just want to show you why it matters. You know, why would you want to add in extra keywords? Well, it comes in handy for sorting. So let's say I have a whole bunch of other files in my data list, like these guys here, and I want to sort them into a certain order. For instance, if I'm using panels, or just for ease of parsing visually the different files in my data list, you can then sort on various columns, and that works just like Excel. So if you click once, it's going to be alphabetical order, so it's blank to guppy, ostrich, zebra. If you click again, it goes in reverse alphabetical order. You can drag these keyword columns to be priority. So if I drag date to be the first one and then sort on it, so it's sorting first by date and then second by sample type, and then subject age third. So if you want to sort on all keywords, you would click on this button here. So you see when I mouse over it, it even says sort on all keywords. So if I click on that, it's put everything into that right order, okay? And if I click on it again, it's putting it in reverse alphanumeric order, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. And that's a very useful tool for if you've got lots of different data files, or even a normal amount of data files, but you have a lot of various descriptors that you want to sort them into priority order for, and then the batch process would follow that order, or it would help you sort your files into iterations if you're doing multi-tube panels, things like that. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's really useful. So you can use these keywords anywhere, of course. So if I want to add in where this keyword, where the file came from in terms of what organism, I can just in the text box right click and go insert token keyword. Okay, and we'll come here to keyword, and I'm going to come down here and select the sample type there. Okay, so now you see it says that it was collected from zebra. I can go to the next file, and that's going to update to the organism it came from. You can add in your keywords elsewhere on your layout. Like if you're doing histogram overlays, it's sometimes very useful to put them in the legend, because like this legend here, let's see if I can get my drawing tools to work. Probably not. Okay, I'm sorry, I can't, but the legend here on this histogram on the bottom, it has a file name which is a little bit long, and if your plot is small, it tends to kind of smush the plot. Right, so what I can do is come into my overlays and change the legend text so that you want to select all the overlays, of course, but change it so that it reflects a keyword rather than just the file name. So I'm going to come down here and select sample type. Okay, so now you see that that's much more compact, and it's also more informative. Okay, so definitely check that out. So let's go to the next category that we have on our agenda. Okay, so gating. So there's various things we can do with gating. So let's talk about all these things, okay? So let's see, we will open up, I think we could close this one. Okay, so let's go to this layout for that. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is if I want to draw gates, like especially let's say you're sort of zoomed out on your layout because you have a lot of plots to look at. And when you zoom out, your plots tend to look, well, they look small, and it tends to be difficult to kind of see the boundaries between different populations, right? So let's say I want to draw a gate around this middle population here, which may be my monocytes. So, I could just do it normal and just start, drawing a gate like this, but it's hard to see the boundaries, right? I don't know if that's really a good gate placement. So a nice trick is if you right click and go to maximize on the plot, come up to your gating tab and select the gate, and then it's just so much easier to kind of see where you're drawing the boundaries. Okay. And then when you're done, don't resize the plot manually because you won't get it back to how it was. Just right click and do restore. And that's a nice way to do it. We also have these replace a gate features. So let's say you decide that your CD4 gate here, you don't want it to be a rectangle anymore. You want it to be a freeform gate. So just select freeform, draw it around your population, and you would do replace an existing gate, and then just choose CD4 and say okay. And now you see that it's been redefined as a freeform. So you don't have to delete it and start over and mess up your hierarchy. That's definitely the better way to do it. And you can even rename the gate by double clicking on it here in the gate view. So if you want to call it CD4 T cells, that works too. Just need to expand my text box a little to see it. Okay. Another useful thing is linking quads and markers to gates. So I'm just going to show it to you with quadrants because it's the same procedure for both. But let's say I have, like if you look at this plot here on the lower left, I'm looking at CD3 versus CD19. So I want to make a couple of gates corresponding to these quads. So if you right click and go to convert quads to gates, I'm going to do lower right. And you want to do convert and link usually, because that way the gate will continue to update when you move the quad around. So I'm going to say this is my CD3 quad gate. Okay. And now you'll see that it really does update in tandem. So if I gate this plot on the top left on my CD3 quad gate, you'll see when I move my quad around that population is updating. Okay, so that's useful if you want to use these quadrants downstream in a further analysis to look at other subset markers. Okay, there's other things too with linking markers to markers. So I'll actually jump to a different layout to show you that. And this is something that was introduced relatively recently. I think we put that in version 6. So you can link marker endpoints. So like in this bottom histogram, as I move my M1 marker, the M2 marker adjusts in tandem so that they're abutting each other. Okay. You can also link markers even on different plots to each other. So if I want to link the M1 on this upper left plot to the M1 on the upper right plot, maybe I want to link, for instance, the lower bound, just highlight the marker, drag the lower, if you have your cursor over it, and then drag the lower bound of that marker onto the lower bound of the recipient marker and let go of your mouse. Now when I move around this M1 lower bound, you see that the one on the right is updating in tandem. If I try to move the lower bound of the second marker on the right, I can't do it because it's already linked to that one, okay? And then there's locking mechanisms too. If you go into the formatting options for markers, you'll see that too, okay? The last thing I want to mention about gating, which let me close this layout and go back to our outline for a second, just to keep this all oriented. So we talked about all these things except for Boolean gating and data-specific gates and snapshots. So just really quick about Boolean gating. I'm not going to actually do any, but I just want to show you that you can do it from the gate view. So if you right-click and go Add Combination Gate, you can start typing the name of any gate and then any Boolean operator like or and then any other gate. Okay, and then so that's a nice way to just get a quick Boolean gate, or you can get your combination gate matrices. So if you highlight 3 gates, and they can be on different plots, they don't have to be defined on the same pairs of parameters, you would just go add combination gate matrix, and then it's going to create all the various Boolean combinations, okay, like the triple positives, triple negatives, everything in between. So that's very useful if you're doing things like intracellular staining and you want to look for your triple secretors, et cetera, or your double secretors, things like that. Okay, and so lastly, about gating, data-specific gates and snapshots. So they're 2 different things. You can use data-specific gates during the batch process if you want to, but most people tend to use snapshots. And snapshots are basically like if you turn on this apply iteration snapshot button, right? And then you go to the next data file and you could, adjust your gate for that particular file. And then when you go back to the previous file, you see that this purple gate went back to its original large size. Okay, so that's a useful tool. I'm not going to go into detail about it because we cover that in gating and batch processing, but usually using snapshots is the easiest way to do that when you're doing a batch process. If you're not doing a batch process though, and you have your plots side by side in the layout, you'll want to use data-specific gates instead. Okay, so I'm opening up that layout here. And I'm sorry, my 8 GB laptop is a little bit slower than I would want it to be, but it's not too bad. Okay, so, as you know, the default behavior of FCS Express is if you move one gate, the gate moves in tandem on all the other samples. These are different samples going across this row. And so I can adjust this monos gate to be appropriate for my controls, which are these 3 plots on the left, but these plots on the right, you see the monos gate, it's not an appropriate placement. So the easiest thing to do is to highlight the gate, click on data specific gate, and then you can resize or reposition the gate for that particular sample, and it'll move independently of the others, okay? Another shortcut if you don't want to use the ribbon and tabs is hold down Shift on your keyboard. Whoops, sorry. Hold down Shift on your keyboard and then move the gate specifically for that sample, okay? So, and then there's all kinds of cool things you can do with data-specific gates. You can make data-specific gate groups. I'm not going to go into detail with that just because I can't, because we have a lot of ground to cover. But definitely check out our gating webinar or our gating help resources if you want to see how to do that, okay? But that way, it allows you to kind of have your global gates here for your controls, I'm sorry, and then have these be independent on your treated samples, okay? That's just one example. Alrighty, so let's go to, I don't need that open anymore. Okay, so let's hop over to our outline one more time. So access issues. One question that comes up a lot tends to be about scaling. So I already mentioned that we have different scalings for different instruments. So for instance, if you're acquiring CyTOF data, we're going to default to ArcSine-H scaling. Most fluorescence data from typical instruments is going to default to biexponential. One question that comes up a lot is how to set your biexponential scaling to be uniform across the plots. So let me show you that layout. Okay, so this one here, so just to back up a second, so biexponential scaling, it was an algorithm developed by BD, and it purposefully changes the min and max and the transition point between linear and log based on the range of your data. So even in a given experiment, you're going to have a little bit of a different data range between files. And that's fine. You can actually just allow that to exist in your layout. But sometimes some people like to set the min and the max and everything to be uniform across their files in terms of the min and the max of the plot, even though the range of the data is variant, okay? So there is a way to do that. And just to highlight what I'm talking about, let me see if I can get my drawing tools to work. Oh, I don't know, I'm so sorry. On my Mac, the drawing tools frequently don't work. Let's see, try one more thing. Okay, I can't. But anyway, on this plot, for instance, whoops. So if you look at this plot here that I'm highlighting in the upper right, you see the x-axis is going up to the last label there is 10 to the 4. So it's probably going up a little bit beyond 10 to the 5, but not much. And then this one here that I'm highlighting, it's going to beyond 10 to the 5. This plot here, the y-axis, the lowest label here is negative 10 to the 3, and then this one is not getting quite as negative. The upper left one, it's negative 10 to the 2. So how would we set this to be uniform across all our files? So you can just select all the plots. I just did a Command A. If you're on a PC, you do Control A, of course. So let's just do the y-axis together, okay? So I'm going to uncheck automatic, leave it on by exponential, and I'm going to set this below 0 value here, where it says use the value. That's the below 0 value, which is the BD terminology. What it means is approximately the most negative data that will be plotted, okay? So why don't I set this to be, just for the purposes of illustration, I'm going to set it to be 4 for all the plots. And then usually that does the trick. Sometimes if your data is got a really variant range, you'll also need to come over here to specific options. And for your y-axis, you would have to enter in a minimum and a maximum. So a lot of times you don't have to do it, but if you have a very wide range, variation in range across your data files, you might want to do that too. So I'm going to enter in, maybe like negative 10,000 here. And for the max, maybe I'll put in 10 to the 5. 100,000, okay? So now you see my y-axis is uniform across all the plots. So I could go and enter in appropriate values for the x-axis also, okay? So let's go to the other thing I wanted to show you about axes. And so if you are looking at a heat map, which you've merged files on, like a lot of people like to merge their files if they're doing a Tisney or a Spade or for other reasons. And then they have this classification identifier on the x-axis, which is the file name. And you can't see all the file names going across for all these wells just because it doesn't fit in the plot. Same thing with bar plots. Like if you've got axis labels that correspond to long file names or other longer text descriptors, you probably want to change your labels to go down 90 degrees so you can see everything, okay? So a quick way to do that, just highlight both the plots and come to your axes. Go to your labels, which is down here, and you're going to put in an angle of 90, okay? And now you see that you can see each descriptor on the axis. Okay, so that's another one down. Let's go to our outline and keep plowing through these tips and tricks. So we already talked about histograms. We're going to skip that. Let's talk about, we're kind of coming here in the home stretch, which is sort of about navigating and formatting layouts, less about data analysis and plot display. So let's talk about tips and tricks with plots. So one thing I'd like to talk about is multiple duplicate next. So usually we encourage our customers to do a batch process. So like if you have 100 samples or even less samples, 20 samples, 10 samples, rather than creating all the plots for all those samples in the layout, which is pretty time consuming, not that efficient, we usually encourage you to do a batch process, which is just setting up a replicate set of plots through which everything will be iterated. So you set up a complement of plots for one file and then you batch process all your files through that set of plots, and then you get all the results for all your data files coming out in PowerPoint, PDF, Excel. That is much faster. But sometimes you need to do multiple duplicated next, or to put it in more general terms, sometimes you want to see all your files side by side in plots within the FCS Express layout. For example, if you're doing like a time course and you've got 10 different time points from 0 hours to 48 hours, and you're like checking the sample every few hours, and you're doing some sort of regression, then you really do need to see each plot side by side in the layout at the same time, because you're comparing it, and maybe you're making a regression curve, like an IC50 or something like that, right? Or a drug concentration test. So the example I want to show you today is basically a titration. Let me open that one back up. So in this titration I'm about to open up, the user has set up an antibody titration because they're trying to figure out what is the right amount of antibody to use of their CD64 antibody, which recognizes their monos. So they've already, this is already set up with the titration. That's not what I want to focus on today, but this would be an example where you don't really want to do a batch process through all of these dilutions from 10 microliter to 0.156, because you want to see them side by side in the layout, because they are what is providing the data for your regression curve, right? So rather than creating a separate page manually and like dragging and dropping various files from the data list to the layout page, which is time consuming, and then you have to arrange everything, there's a nice trick for getting basically all of these plots, well, this plot in particular, because that's what the titration is based off of, the MFI of this purple population on FL8, the y-axis of the plot. So there's a way to get that plot for all of these files at once. So you can just select the plot and come to Home, Multiple, Duplicate, and Next. And I like to put it in a grid. So we'll come to our grid options, and I think I'll do 2 columns by 3 rows. That should be enough, right? Or maybe I'll do 4 rows because I have 7 files. That way they'll all fit on one page because I have 7 serial dilutions, and that's enough space for 8 plots. I'm going to change my gap mode to minimal just so that I don't have a big white border between columns. And then I'm going to click OK. And again, and if we give this a few moments, you see now this has generated a page with that titration relevant plot for each of the files, okay? And you can even do this if you wanted to see multiple plots for each file, you could do that too, but I only need to see the one. So that's a very useful thing in certain instances, although again, I really suggest that for your typical immunophenotyping experiments where you're just analyzing quickly data from 10, 20 mice or whatever it is, do a batch process instead. It's just much more efficient, okay? So that's that. I want to also show you aligning and grouping plots. And I think I have that layout open. So that's, again, we're still here on tips and tricks with plots. And we're going to show you how to align and group plots together. Here we go. So let's say you've created a layout and it looks pretty scattered like this, and you want to make all the plots the same size, and you want to have them nice and neatly in columns and rows. Okay, so first let's tackle making them all the same size. So first, decide which size you want the plots to be. Maybe I want them to be this size. Okay, so click on that plot first, and then holding down Command or Control, depending on what operating system you're on, select the other plots, and you'll come up to your Align tool. So you're going to do Align Widths, Align Heights, okay? And now they're all the same size, one step down. Now, how do I get them to at least, be aligned with each other? So maybe I'm going to move this down. I want them to fill the page. So just arrange a column first. Then you can just select the entire column and do Align Left. And I want to distribute the spacing vertically evenly, so I do distribute vertically. So now that's a nice column. And then you can do the same thing here. So if I want to Let's move this so it's at least on the page. So maybe I want to align these to top, okay? And same thing with this. So select the first one that you want to be the guide and then select the others. Whoops, I think I accidentally duplicated them somehow. Okay, and again, I'm just going to do my align left and distribute vertically. Okay, so now you have the layouts looking nice and aligned. Okay, so that's kind of a useful thing if you're having a lot of plots on one page. Okay, so another thing about layout formatting. So I'm going to open up this layout while I talk. This is a very large layout I'm about to open up, which is why I closed it before. So let's say you're doing an analysis and you want the results to look fairly professional or just nicely designed. Maybe it's a layout you're going to use often or a layout that you're creating for clients or collaborators, and you would just like it to look somewhat professional. So this one actually already has a logo on it, so I'm just going to delete it for the purposes of illustration. So let's say you want to have your lab logo or your university logo or your corporate logo appearing on every page. Okay, so the easiest way to do that rather than copy and pasting it to each page is come to view master page and take a picture. So you can either go insert picture and put in a TIFF or a JPEG or a PNG of the logo or any other info that you want to be repeating on all your files, or you can even use the clipboard. So I'm going to just quickly take a picture of I'm just going to take a picture of the logo from this website here, right? So I'm just doing my screenshot software there, and I can just do a paste. Okay, so I'm going to move this up into the upper right and make it smaller. Okay, you can lock the aspect ratio if you don't want to have it warped like that. Okay, but now when I go to my other pages, you see that my logo is there on every page. Okay, and you can even put it off the page if you have really crowded layouts and there's no room for it. But that's a handy tool. And then obviously the other thing about layout organization is don't restrict yourself to one page. Look at this layout. It's got 13 pages. You can see in the bottom right corner, sorry, the bottom left corner of my layout, it's telling you that you have 13 pages. Okay, so you can use all those pages and you can even view multiple pages at a time. So if you come to the view tab, you can look at 2 pages at a time, side by side like this. Okay, and you can arrange the boundary as you want. You can even look at 4 pages at a time. So, and you can drag and drop objects between pages too. So it's another thing that makes it easier to navigate. So with these complex layouts, it's, as I mentioned before, it's sometimes hard to find your way around them. So we have these navigators, which are useful for finding your way around them. So let me show you how those work. So in this layout that we've been talking about, we have multiple files. This is a 6-tube panel. It's a clinical layout where for every patient, 6 different sample tubes are required. So maybe you want to find the page where your TNK sample is, and you don't want to click on each page and look for it. You just want to be brought to it. So the easiest thing to do there is open up your data navigator here from the view tab. I usually like to dock these on the left or right, because when I do that, I can expand my TNK node, and then when you hover your mouse over each one of these plots, you get a handy little thumbnail image, and it helps you find the plot you're looking for. So maybe this is the one I want, this one that's CD5 versus, oops, went away, CD5 versus CD38. So if I click on that, the software actually takes you to the relevant page and highlights the plot for you. Okay, so the Gate Navigator works the same way, except instead of helping you find plots by file, it's helping you find plots that are gated on a certain gate. Okay, so like if you were looking for a certain plot that's gated on your myeloid cells, just expand the node and again, use these little thumbnails and just click on any one of these and it'll take you right to it. I'm not going to actually do it because it's the same thing. Same thing with your layout navigator. That's another tool. And this is, each node here represents a different page in your layout. And if you expand the node, it shows you what are the different elements on that page. So if I look at my first statistics page and I click on one of these text boxes, for example, it will take me to that text box there, okay? And again, the mousing over hover text images works for this too. So like if you're looking for one of your summary tables, you know, just navigate, hover your mouse over each one, and it will take you to that and highlight it for you. Okay, so try that out. It's a very useful tool. I'm going to close that up. All right, so we're almost done here. Looks like I'm going to go a little bit over. I do apologize for that, but I will still stay if there's questions. Okay, so exporting images and other files. So the easiest way to do that is to use the clipboard, and that works for single or grouped images, but you can also do it via the batch process, which I'll show you where it is. I'm not actually going to do it because if you know how to do a batch process, it's pretty trivial to add that in. Okay, but let me show you the easy way with the clipboard first of all. So like if you want to export this plot here, you can just right click on the border and say save selection as picture. You can even do it for multiple plots. Like let's say you want both of these together. Oops. Just highlight both of them and go save selection as picture. And then you choose the format you want. So maybe I'll do a JPEG and I'm going to put this on my desktop and I'll say bar plot and scatter. Okay, and now when I open up that picture, you'll see that it's both of those plots together in one JPEG file. Okay, so that's really handy. You can also just use the clipboard, like if you just want to copy and paste into PowerPoint or Word or anything, just right click on your selection and do copy, and then go to your Word program or PowerPoint or whatever it is and just do a Command V or a Control V to paste. Okay, but if you do need to export something to your batch actions, you can do this save as picture. And of course, this will create pictures for each of your iterations. So if you have like 10 different files, you'll get a set of 10 pictures. And here you can select your various image formats. And in the case of JPEG, you can change your quality. TIFFs, you can select your resolution. So sometimes you need to do this because a journal has a certain requirement for dots per inch, etc. So that's there if you need to do that, okay? So let's see, what else? So now we're going to talk about, we're almost done here, and thanks for sticking with me. This is a very interesting webinar because it's like a mishmash of things. Okay, so reusing layouts as templates. So this is something we do show most of the time in our Getting Started webinar, but I'm going to show it to you today anyway because it's just really useful, and I'm going to give you another little tip for when you do that. So why don't we use this batching layout that we've already created, and let's say I want to save this as a template for reuse. So I can just go File, Save As, and I'll put it on my desktop and I'll call it my batching template. Okay, and we'll say unlinked. And so unlinked is basically the version of the layout that will not contain any data. It'll just be empty plots that you can reuse as a template over and over again. So I'll say save. And one other thing I want to show you. So in your batch actions, you have these different actions lined up, right? So if I look at my PowerPoint one, for example, this is going to be the file name, okay? So every time you rerun this batch process for when you reuse the template, you can check off this box to ask for confirmation before overwriting that PowerPoint file. But in addition, you can automate the naming of your files. So rather than it being called experimentsummary.pptx every time, which would overwrite itself, even though if it asks you if you want to overwrite it, you could say no, but then you'd have to come back in and retitle it like experiment summary 2 or whatever. A much more efficient thing to do is click on T for token, and you can basically give this a dynamic name that will be automatically unique for every time you reuse that template. So I'm going to add keyword, and I find the easiest thing is just to add the date keyword, because every time you repeat the experiment, it's a new date, and your cytometer will have added that day's date to your metadata. So if you do this, effectively, the name of this PowerPoint file is going to be experiment summary, in this case, 27 March 2008.pptx. And then when you repeat it, it's going to be, today's date, right? So you automatically have uniquely named PowerPoint, Excel, and PDF batch process exports. Okay, so anyway, so I'll save that. And now remember, this is my unlinked template, but I have to close it and reopen it to see it come up as unlinked. Okay, so this is empty of any data. So now I can just load in my files from the time I repeated my experiment. So, let's say I had these. Doesn't have to be the same number of files. Okay, I had 9 before. This time I only have 6. And just double click on the first one. And if you have multiple overlays and they're all showing the same file, you want to do this, change all overlays on all objects to selected file. If you had like control overlays, there's a different way to do that. You could just initially just do this same one, and then there's a way to just set the overlay. But I don't want to get into detail about that. Again, that's more kind of batch related. So we'll just do the simple case today. And now you see, I'm done with my analysis. That took less than 30 seconds, right? So why recreate the wheel? So please reuse your layouts as templates as much as possible. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you before I open up the floor for questions is the autosave and layout history, okay? And I'm going to go back into my user options, which is via file tab options, or from the bottom here, when you click on your logged in as name and go to options, it'll take you to the same place. And okay, so one here is your autosave options. So what this is it is going to automatically save the layout every few minutes. I've unchecked it, but this helps, like in case you get a crash or something. FCS Express will have in many cases saved an earlier version of your layout, and then when you restart FCS Express, it'll try to launch that autosave. So that's handy. We also have the layout history, which is, I believe that's down here. Yep, so right here where it says history options, this is something a little different. So like if you have a layout called experiment, mouse experiment.fey, every time you save it, normally it just overwrites it, right? But if you put on history options and change this to something greater than 0, so like 2 copies, 3 copies, etc., every time you save your mouse experiment.fey, it will save another version of that layout instead of overwriting the previous save, okay? And it's going to save them in a history subfolder within the same folder. So if your mouse experiment.fa is in My Documents, within My Documents, there's going to be another subfolder there. And in that subfolder are the previous versions of the mouse experiment.fa. Okay, so like that's if you're making a lot of changes to layouts and you don't know which one you're really going to want to use long term. So what I see a lot of users doing is they do mouse experiment 1.fa, mouse experiment 2.fa. You can keep doing that if you want to, but instead you could just do normal saves instead of save as, and use this history options. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So that's all I have to show you today. That was quite a lot, right? So thank you very much for attending. This webinar is being recorded and it will be put online on our YouTube channel and our videos channel. So also what you can do is a lot of the tips that I've talked about today, if you go to denovosoftware.com and then scroll to the bottom and click on knowledge base, it's going to take you to our knowledge base, which is a bank of various often asked questions. So for instance, like I talked about access labels, if you start searching for the word access, just give it a minute to refresh. Okay, so you click on this first result here and it's going to tell you how to change your access labels to stay in a name and also tell you what to do to affect the change on an existing layout. Remember, because I mentioned that takes a couple other steps and that's why it's best to do it at the beginning. So, you know, there's various knowledge base articles. You can kind of scroll through and just see what you're looking for. But you can also write to us at support@denovosoftware.com. and we'll be very happy to answer your questions there. And our response is guaranteed within 24 hours, but in most cases we respond much more quickly, like within a few hours, and we'll be able to help you out by email, but if it's more in depth, we'll probably suggest a screen share with you. So if you have a screen share request, you could just email us right away and we could probably get something set up for next week. Okay, so now I'm going to take a look at the questions. I see Robin has been doing a great job answering most of those. And then there's some at the end that are maybe a little bit off topic from what we're talking about. So one question about compensation. So we're doing a compensation webinar next week. And so that's a little bit more in depth. So I would say join us for that webinar next week if you can. And if your questions were urgent, we can follow up with you via email and or just email us at support@denovosoftware.com with your question. Okay, I see a question about okay, so Amanda, we'll follow up with you offline. We'll have to see what the issue is with your gate and quad percents. You know, my guess is maybe they're referring to a different overlay, or I'm not sure. I'll have to see your layout. But thank you for the question, and I'm sure we can help you address that on a screen share. Okay. And I do see a couple other compensation questions, and I see Robin is getting to those, but definitely join us for the compensation webinar. Can you set the default gate color? So Chris asked a question, can you set the default gate color to always be black? Yes, you can. If you come to your options and go to gate, the gate category, and click on default gate colors, you can just change all of these to black. You'll have to do it one by one though, okay? And yes, you can change the default features of the plots. Thank you for that question. It's actually something I had wanted to talk about and there just wasn't enough time. But yeah, you would go to your options and go to plots. And for instance, you could go to axes options if you want to change your axes fonts. So if you find that the axes fonts are a little too small, you know, you can change on the font, change the font size for the titles there. And or the labels, like if the 10 to the 4, 10 to the 3, etc. is too small or too big, change that there. Change the font type, the font color, all that's customizable. Anyway, everything is there under plots. Like you can come to borders, turn off your plot borders, right? We do no line in that case. So just check out the different options there. I think it's going to have what you need. Any other questions? I am sticking around for a few minutes, so please feel free to type those in. And if you have not already, if you're not already an FCS Express customer, please go to denovosoftware.com and download our demo. So you can just Google FCS Express or just go to denovosoftware.com. And at the very top here, it says free demo. So click on that and you'll be able to create a free account on our website. And that's a 30-day fully functional demo. So don't hesitate to download that. It's going to have all the features you need. You can analyze your own data. You're not limited to our sample data. And follow along there. The other thing I want to point out is our help resources. So if you go to File Help or just look on our website for the manual, you can search for help on any particular topic. So for instance, if you're looking for gate. I see a question, can you block the features you change for the next analysis? You can set certain plots to be non-changeable, but as far as blocking features, you can't prevent user options from being changed unless you have a network license with security, okay? But for most research folks don't have that, so you would be limited to things like just setting different plots, preventing different plots from being edited. Okay, so we'll follow up with you offline about that too. There is no way to set your default first gate to be forward scatter versus side scatter. That's a great question, but I think we just always put in parameter 1 versus parameter 2. So in a lot of cases that does result in forward scatter versus side scatter, but for people who've acquired area, height, and width for every parameter, then they might get forward scatter A versus forward scatter H. So, I mean, I would suggest don't acquire area, height, and width for every parameter if you don't need it, because it just makes your data file size bigger anyway. So if you just need area and you just collect area, it will default to forward scatter versus side scatter. Okay. Alrighty, and let's see if I can open up a relevant layout to answer one of these questions. So authorizations, okay. So regarding Marcella's question about blocking features, well, I can answer your question about blocking plots because every license type will be able to do that. So you can select the plot and then just go into your formatting options like I have here on the right. And you can say edit and say never allowed. And that way, when you share this layout with somebody, they will not be able to edit this plot at all. So I don't know if that helps you, but we can talk to you afterwards and see what it is exactly that you're trying to restrict. And thank you so much. Have a great long weekend for our American customers. Happy Memorial Day. And for everyone else, hope to see you soon in an upcoming webinar.